Hey everyone, it's Vanessa Callaghan, and I'm so excited to welcome you to the Calm, Empowered Parent podcast. Together, let's challenge the idea that parenting has to be perfect. We know that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to raising children, and while love is the key, it sure helps to have the right tools for the job. Raising resilient humans is intensely personal and even transformative work, and I'm here for it. Let's laugh, cry, heal, and learn together. Here we go. I feel like it's skipping a crucial step if we go straight to how to help your kid feel better about their dead pet.
Yeah.
They can go Google that and there will be tip sheets out there. But I feel like what we're talking about in this episode is how to lay the groundwork so that you don't even need the tip sheet, because you'll instinctively pull from your presence what to do.
Yeah.
And I think that is a deeper knowing and trusting of yourself that will apply across so many situations. So you don't have to look it up to figure it out. You have a good instinct around it that you're building as you build this presence.
Yeah. It's about self-trust too, because it's like, I've got all these grief books, but if my kid's having a moment, I'm not going to go and read the whole book
really quick.
Maybe I will. Like, I'm not that kind of parent.
Welcome to our episode on grief and loss. And I'm so excited to bring in two of my favorite people to talk through life transitions and loss with, which is Reverend Cormier of Walk Through Grief with Grace, and Matias, Haynes, who's here to help us understand life transitions. Welcome, both of you. I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Thanks, Vanessa.
Yeah, and some of you may know that Rev Jen is a grief guide. You may not know she's also a ceremonial artist, and she is a mom as well of a 9-year-old boy and has two really cute, cuddly rescue kittens at home right now, Tom and Bessie, and who are actually not kittens anymore. They've grown up a bit in San Diego. And I'm so excited that she brings a special experience in 2 decades of the arts and somatic healing to her work. And she helps families through life transitions and loss. And she's poured her heart and soul into her own podcast called Walk Through Grief with Grace, and also a growing Grace Collective, which is a unique community of big-hearted humans ready to step into living and create more fully than ever before. We're so excited to have you here, Jen, and hear your perspective. And then, of course, we also have Barb. So one thing that you should know about Barb, Matias, Haynes, is that we didn't know each other until we were on an airplane and we sat next to each other, and she was working through this workbook that I was like, what is this woman working on? What is she up to? We started talking and realized that we had so much that we wanted to explore together. So it's my great pleasure to bring in someone who's new to me, but I'm getting to know very well. And Barb is an ICF professional certified coach. She's a teacher, a facilitator. She's even been a coach to one of my coaches that I brought into my program, I found out recently. And an experienced business consultant. And she does help folks through life's biggest challenges and has her unique perspective, having been a single mom of 3 kids. And even she's putting her family first, finding joy in everyday life and things like the outdoors and skiing and snorkeling and surfing and supping, or just being out in nature. But she's really passionate about her work and draws from 20 years of experience in large corporate settings, fast-paced startups, nonprofit organizations, and entrepreneurial ventures. So she's coached all kinds of folks, like from seasoned executives to entrepreneurs to new college grads and stay-at-home moms. And she's here as a transition coach, and we're going to learn more about that as we dive into our topic today. So when we think about this topic, I always have to ask my guests who specialize, why did you pick this area to focus on? Because both of you are so capable of guiding folks on many areas of life, business, relationships, like all kinds of things. But what is it that inspires you to focus your work on grief and transitions? And, I'd love to hear from you, Jen.
Yeah, what I'm noticing now that I've been really focusing on grief the last 4 years is that it's really a potent portal when we go through a major loss that it feels sometimes overwhelming and like the world has ended. But what's so beautiful about it is there's so much potential for our own growth and evolution. Once we've gone through, we've really been taken all the way down to our knees. It's this real chance to have a brand new start, to really live more fully and love more fully and create. And that's what I see with a lot of the folks that I've been working with. They go through a year-long process of really letting go and healing and reconnecting to love in new ways, since this channel that they were used to giving so much love is no longer there. It's like,
Yeah.
how do I reorganize my energy, and give my love in new ways? And from that can sprout amazing new creativity. So that's like, because I'm an artist and a creator, I feel like it's the most potent time to create something new. And I see books being written, poems, plays, dances, all of that comes out of doing the grief work. So even though it's sort of a paradox, even though people think, gosh, that's got to be so dark and so hard, like, I can't believe you do that work, working with people in grief all the time. I say, you'd be surprised. There's actually so much lightness and hope and creativity in it.
And I've heard like the science of the emotion grief that, we're always in positive psychology looking for what is the positive thing about these emotions that have been labeled negative, like you're saying. And from grief, it's actually, and loss and sadness, it's making meaning. Like we
Yes.
only feel grief around the things that were meaningful, people, places, things, animals that were meaningful to us. And then we get to find out why when we experience that loss, like why was that person, place, or thing or animal meaningful to me? And you get to learn so much about yourself. And I love this aspect of creativity coming from it. That's really inspiring. Thank
Yeah.
you. Barb, what about for you? I'm curious, like what kind of makes you passionate about grief work and transition work? I mean, you label yourself a transition coach, which, a lot of folks aren't familiar with. Can you
Yeah,
walk us through?
it comes from a very personal place. So, my journey with grief and loss started when my dad got really sick. And after a few years of him, having a massive stroke and being debilitated, he passed when I was 33 years old. And at the time, I was 8 months pregnant with my first child. So it was very much like a circle of life moment for me. And it took me a really, really long time to have some resolve around the loss of my father at what to me was a pretty early age. I'm the youngest of seven. So I felt like I was cheated of the experience of having more time with my father, having him meet my children. So it really started around then. And during the time when I was reckoning with the pending loss of my father, I remember I was working in the corporate setting in downtown San Francisco, and I was there with my briefcase and my business suit, and another coworker who was also experiencing a little bit of grieving through his ailing mom told me to read the book, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. And it was so powerful to look at not just death, but also life with a whole different lens. In Western society, we really take it a very different way from, Eastern practices, whether it be, Tibetan or Indian or even, what other, non-Christian based faith. And it helped me to take the weight of sadness off of the pending loss of my father, and at least crack the door open to a different way of viewing grief and loss, which is really about impermanence, right? So this idea that the only thing you can really count on is change. And from that moment, when my dad passed, my whole perspective on life changed. I became much less about climbing the corporate ladder and more about raising my son and then two more children after him. And it was like a significant shift in my life. And at the same time, I dug deep into brain science. I was so, my dad had amyloid angiopathy, which was bleeding strokes. And so around that time, I just dived into the brain science to understand what was going on with his brain. And so I'm kind of a neuroscience nerd now. I don't have a degree in it, but I just dive into all the books around the neuroscience of it because it helps me pair my biology with my neurobiology, right? So the emotional part of it. And so I feel like what I've learned over the years and why it's become so deep is because I've now neurobiologically understand what's happened to me. So emotionally, the sadness and the weight of loss, but then also biologically, like why these things were happening to me. And so it's very personal. I then had a mom who had dementia over the past 10 years. I lost two brothers recently. So loss is something that is a part of my life. And if I don't incorporate it with, openness and with authenticity, then I will miss out on the beauty of what remains. So it comes from a very personal place. And I really want other people to know that. I want them to know that there is beauty that remains, that there's the memories of our loved ones and or even our past lives.
Yeah.
There is a piece of it that still remains.
Well, this makes so much sense that the two of you would dedicate your good energies and time and effort to this work, given both of your backgrounds and experiences. And we're here to talk about parents and caregivers guiding children through grief and loss. And Barb, you have three kids, 15, 18, and 20, and Rev Jenn is here with her 9-year-old son. And I guess why do you think for this generation of parents and children is this conversation more important than ever? I've had my own one-on-ones with each of you about this, and I just think it's so important for us to kind of give some context to the strategies and tips we might be sharing with folks later on in the episode. Barbara, what would you say about this? Why does this moment in our society, our cultural experience, how parents are now approaching parenting, from your view over these past decades, like why is this even more important than ever?
I think that the pandemic really shifted the worldview around um, awareness, self-awareness, understanding of self. We were forced to really change the way we live, and some of us experience the loss of the way we live. And and for these newer generations who haven't experienced this, there's again, impermanence says that there's going to be some major life event that's going to happen in your life, whether it's 9/11 or the pandemic or some massive world war. And we'd gotten to this place where there was a lot of comfort and contentment of just the way things were. And part of me sometimes feel like, nature goes into these cycles where, okay, you know, nature is about change and growth. And so here's this big opportunity for all of us to see death for what it is, meaning it is part of life. If no one died, we wouldn't appreciate everything that was part of life today, right? And we'd be like, oh, it's fine. I'm going to live another 100 years. I'll just do that in 10 years from now or whatever it is. So we miss the beauty of, of the moment. And I also think because of what happened in the pandemic, we now have all these things unpacked in front of us. And we have this really beautiful opportunity to look at those things and question them, not with, trying to solve a problem, but just with curiosity. So if we can be curious about what comes up and then also share that curiosity with our kids or with people around us, then we stop defaulting back to old habits that aren't necessarily working for us anymore. And I think that fundamental shift came from the lessons that we learned in the pandemic. That I'll take a surfing metaphor, right? So you can go out surfing and it could be super chill, but then a big set comes on and you have to be prepared. And then you might bail, you might fall in the water and lose it, but you pop back up and you grab your board and you get back going. And so there's going to be those moments where waves are going to come at us. And I think it's so much more important for us to know that another wave is coming, but we're going to build resilience now by being aware of those things so that we can get through the next wave that comes through. And before, especially when it comes to parenting, a lot of times we're trying to helicopter over our children to make sure that they don't crash on that big wave or they don't fall off their bike without assistance. And in this case, it's allowing folks to fall down and get back up and learn those lessons on the way back up.
Love that. I mean, as I'm passionate about resilience. That's part of why my company is called Raising Our Resilience. And there is this trend for parents to want to, and the reason I'm bringing this up as a trend is that I talk to school principals all the time. So in addition to working with parents, I'm also an educational consultant and I do professional development. And last year, in the last 12 months alone, I've gone to 20 schools, giving school workshops and talking to, the folks there. And there's what they've been sharing with me is that because parents are concerned about the mental health of their kids or the, sort of their emotional well-being, but they don't have a whole lot of experience about like what is a normal amount of distress for kids to experience, or adversity, or kind of like that fail and then learn from mistakes and failure. They're kind of padding their kids from having any adverse experience, and what it's really robbing them of is an opportunity to process these tough things, if they're being so sheltered from it. So I know some of what we're going to get into is how do we actually directly communicate with our kids and normalize experiences of loss and grief and the feelings and the whole range of emotions that can come with, those adverse experiences, and make meaning of them. So I know, Jenn, this is something you're really passionate about. I would love to hear from you also, like, why now? Like, why is this conversation really important with this generation?
Yeah, I think that point that you made, Barb, about the pandemic is a real important one. I think we're seeing the effects, now, some years later. And also we're in a really interesting time, because it's an unprecedented amount of social media and images that we're seeing around the world, at our fingertips. We're seeing atrocities at our fingertips. Our children are seeing things, at this young age on screens, but what are they actually able to experience in life? So, if you go back just 150 years ago or so, when we had birth and death were part of life, it was part of the home. You went into the parlor, there was a door that you went into and out of, and here's the door where the bodies went out when they died, and you died in your house and you gave birth in your house. And I was really shocked when I went through a couple of different death doula trainings to, help families. I was trained to help families create their own home funerals, like direct their own funerals at home. And I don't want to get too much off tangent, but I think it's important to note that we used to really have our children be part of the full life cycle, right? They saw their brothers and sisters born, they saw their grandparents and their parents die, they physically buried people in the ground. It was part of life, and they were part of the community and part of the family, and that was a natural thing. And I think that your point around the kids being so sheltered, Vanessa, is really one for us to look at as parents and go, what am I keeping my child from? And could I instead open up the world to them so they can be a part of it? And now, even if you're in a hospital, you don't see any dead bodies. I learned that they actually have a gurney that just looks like it's an empty gurney, like, oh, there's nobody on it. And they actually hide the dead bodies underneath so that no one ever sees a dead body in a hospital. And there's a separate door where they go out. So it's just, we are so sheltered as adults from dying and death and birth. So, how can we build a bridge for our children to more experiences if we ourselves are so sheltered from experience? So, how can we open up to more range of experience and then bring our kids along with us? A specific tangible thing. This summer, I brought my son back to the East Coast to visit my families, mostly on the East Coast. My mom's best friend, her husband died, and he's been part of our family. I went to their wedding when I was 5 years old. He's been up every time we go to Washington and visit my grandmother, we'd see them, really, really close family friends. And he declined very rapidly in May and was on hospice quickly and died. And we went back for about 3 weeks, and his funeral happened to line up on a weekend that we were there. And it was 11 hours of driving in one day to get down to this funeral and back. And people were like, you don't have to go to this funeral, Jenn. Your mom's going, you're going to drag Akoya to the funeral. You're going to drive 5.5 hours each way. And it felt like a real important decision for me to say, no, I'm going to spend this weekend, and we're going to drive, and we're going to leave at 5 a.m. We're not going to get home till 11 p.m. because I want my son to go to this funeral. I want him to experience this funeral, and that's important to me. And I see funerals that I've officiated, memorial services where parents will choose to not bring the kids. And at every turn, I encourage families to bring their children into ceremonial space, into weddings. That's a little more accepted, but also into funerals. So if you're a parent listening to this, like, should I bring my child to the funeral? My answer is absolutely yes.
I love that you're being really specific about what kinds of experiences, like Barb and I were just chatting, kind of riffing off of this idea of kids experiencing that big wave so they can fall, experiencing, the ceremonial moments of our family where there's birth, marriages, death, getting to see the full sort of natural cycle of life and be close to it. I think what stood out to me the most, though, I have to say, Jenn, is that a lot of the parents haven't had that, because you were talking about 150 years ago. A lot of grown adults right now who are aspiring to be really, empowering parents who are helping their kids become emotionally intelligent and, equipped for life. We are not necessarily resilient to these things because we haven't had, the experience of seeing, for example, a dead body, or being really close to the gnarliness of natural childbirth, or like and everything in between. And so, I guess as we're shifting to this next question, I kind of want to bring in this element of like, how do we help not just our kids, but ourselves as the guides to these children be able to integrate these experiences into our everyday lives in a way that, feels approachable? Because I'm imagining there are some things you now understand, but wish you knew sooner about how grief works. And in there, I think we have some clues for how we might start like bringing these, allowing our kids to have contact with these experiences. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, what would you say, Barb, about bringing that in?
Yeah, I love Jen's idea of having, bringing your kids to funerals. I mean, culturally, the funerals I've been to are always kind of big parties. And there's prayer service that we come together. There's like a whole series, 9 days of a novena. 40th day after the passing, we also recognize them. We gather at the funeral, and then we have a party after the funeral. There's a prayer service. I mean, and it's a place where, all family gets together, and it's like a combination of joy, laughter, and tears, because you get there and you see your cousins that you haven't seen in forever, and you laugh about old stories, but yet you're grieving the fact that, especially when my mom passed in January, there's a World War II generation, and she's like one of the last World War II sisters. And so all of us felt the difference. And so, of course, that inspired stories, right? And I think storytelling is a really big thing. Like, if your parents are still around and your kids have an opportunity to speak to their grandparents about how they grew up, that is a really fantastic way to like be so in tuned with the story. And if we think about that from a cultural standpoint, that's the way stories were handed down. They weren't like Instagram stories or TikTok stories. They were sitting and listening to the stories of lives in the past by our elders, right? And I think that is just a fabulous thing. And so it's not just the funerals, it's the family gatherings. And I know in the past, I come from a very rich, very deep family where like just my own family is 25 people. And so cousins and extended family could be like 50 to 100. And when I was growing up, we used to gather, and my mom and dad would talk about stories about the past and things like, yeah, they used to bury the people under the house, and services were there. My mom's sister was basically a midwife, and she helped my mom, birth her first 3 children. So even though we ourselves, Gen Xers and whatever, don't actually have that experience, I have the story from my mom, the stories that, her parents told her. And so whenever there's a family gathering with the sort of elders in the room, it's a fantastic opportunity for your children to hear about those stories and really resonate with them, as opposed to just seeing it on the internet. And, a really great movie that I'm trying to get my kids to watch is Band of Brothers, because one of these are men who lived through World War II, and death was all around them everywhere, and that is a generation where you would hear that people died in war. You would hear that people died of starvation. You would hear that your village or your city was attacked. So it was a whole different way of being. And anyone else who's, experienced that war, I mean, that is our past. Those are our elders, and there's lessons in each of those discussions. So I really do believe in the power of story. And when it comes from somebody you really respect, then even more powerful for your children, right?
Well, I love this opportunity to have depth and connection, like, and not wait till the person dies
Yes.
to be
Yes.
connected to their story. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times that I've been in a funeral and then they review their life story, and everyone's saying, they're like, I didn't know that about grandpa. And that's great. But then it's also like, well, what were all the missed opportunities to maybe sit and have a pot of tea and hear those stories when they're still living? So yes. Yes.
And
One thing, yeah.
even if you're not living, going through the old pictures.
Yes, that too.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think in stories, by the way, children are hardwired to learn from stories and to pay attention to stories and to engage in stories and create stories. Stories is one of the most important vehicles in the educational field for learning that is often overlooked. We read books, but what about real personal stories from your own life and the art of storytelling? And I know Jenn has a lot to say about this one. I can hand it to you in a moment. I also wanted to bring in one thing that I wish I knew sooner about how grief works, which is that laughter and humor and levity is a part of the coping process. And that, this whole thing of like, I don't want to go to a funeral because I might embarrass myself by laughing. I just love the picture you painted, Barb, about the celebration of life and how there is laughter and there is joy and there's stories. And so let's start, like, I feel like we're putting together the picture of like how grief works together. Let me kick it to Jenn, because I know she has more to say on these topics.
Yeah, I absolutely on the power of story and the laughter. It ties right in with one thing I wish I knew about grief was really that it magnifies life, and the celebration and the gratitude and the pleasure and the humor and all of that is at the table along with grief. So and one thing that does is it really um, gives us the opportunity to connect more deeply with the people that we love, because we connect when we have a need, and we're able to, no matter what generation, what age we are, you can feel that sense of belonging. You can feel a sense of value, like I am valuable in this family. I belong in this family and I can contribute. So if you're a 3-year-old, you can give a hug, right? You can participate in singing a song, you can put a flower, you can take these really simple but powerful ritual actions together with your family members, and that really creates a sense of cohesion
Yeah.
in a family system.
Absolutely.
Beautiful.
And I love how you talked about that, Jen. The thing that's coming up for me is that when you relay this story, you're actually part of that story too, right? As the adult, you are a reflection of who your parents were, even if they aren't around. And I know every parent has that moment where they say something to their child. You're like, oh my God, that's exactly what my mom said to me. And here I am spilling it out. So as you relay this story of what your parents went through, you're helping your kids understand that dimension of. And again, my kids were never able to meet their dad, so it was so important for me to tell his story, like in a very loving way, and also in a way that showed how much I missed him, but then also knew that I am part of him. Like he and my mom made me, and so there's nothing. So I'm still part of his legacy, and so are my children. And but it's that kind of language, that kind of vocabulary. If we disassociate from all of our past and cut those ties, when we don't talk about those things, then your kids will never know those things. They'll never have that resonance, and then they'll lose the sense of belonging, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that my kids know that they come from a very rich culture from my side. And they appreciate and they really lean into it, and they love when my siblings tell stories, because it's from a different angle about what my life was like growing up and what it was like to live with my parents, their grandparents. So It's really
And
so simple and yet so impactful.
Yeah.
And Barb, I wonder if you can speak to just one thing you learned about how the brain works when it's grieving that folks might
Yeah,
be able to sort of take away and ponder and recognize in themselves when they experience
absolutely.
grief. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, I'm a neuroscience nerd, so I love reading how the brain works. And this happens with any long relationship that you've been. And a book I have read, it's called The Grieving Brain. It creates a metaphor. So when you lose somebody, it's the metaphor is you're in your home and you walk down the stairs and you notice your dining table is missing. It was just there. It was right there. But for some reason it's missing. And then you're like, wait, like it was just there yesterday. And what that speaks to is the way the brain maps, right? So it maps like this internal Google map in your head of the people in your life, the things in your life. And so when somebody passes away and something comes to mind, you're like, oh, I'm going to call that person. That's your brain mapping, trying to map to that same spot. But then that person on the other side isn't there. And, and that happens with not just loss, but divorce as well. So your brain is accustomed, for as long as you've known that person in your life, to think of that person because of that map. And that's something I didn't know. It took me a long time to understand that brain, that part of me is the biological part that had to reckon with the emotional part. And so now that I know that, it's like I can give myself a little bit of a break for having spent so much time trying to figure out why I felt so lost because
Mm.
my dad wasn't there, or my ex wasn't there, or my mom couldn't remember my name, right? Because for years and years and years, I've been carving this pathway of that relationship. So really, loss also magnifies the loss of a relationship with somebody, not just the physical, the hug, whatever, but that relationship. Anytime that you think of that person, that's more of your brain map. And so when we recognize it, then we can have that awareness, and we don't always have to solve it in the moment. Maybe we take that awareness, we put it up on a shelf for a little bit and say, okay, I'm aware of this thing. And now my next step is the next time I hit that, can I at least be curious about it and then decide, whether I have the tools for what I need to do, or if I should start figuring out what tools I should use. So that's the one piece, again, that I've learned over years of diving into books about the brain that really, really helped me a lot.
I've been thinking about it recently about like these almost like fabric, like there's these threads that sort of weave together. And really, if you look at a map of the synapses in the brain, it's an incredibly dense structure of all these connections. And there are just certain threads that are going to be connected to these relationships, like you're describing it. That's really helpful, Barb. Thank you. Because I think sometimes when we get a hit of like, oh, I used to call my mom for this. Like I remember my mom when she lost her father, who was like her rock. She said that the most startling thing was the permanence, that she couldn't pick up the phone and call him anymore. And that she had all these things that she used to call him for. And then she would think of him and she couldn't call him anymore. And it took a while for her brain to sort of go, okay, you're not going to call him, but you're going to, maybe remember him and maybe call another family member instead and talk about it, And so she found something else to do with that instinct. But the fact that it was there and so present in her mind, like, thank you for helping us understand that that's just structurally true. It's like
Yeah.
not something you should be over faster or
Yeah.
something like that. I love that. Thank you. That's really compassionate to the process.
And just to add another detail to that, so it starts with awareness, which a lot happens when you understand something about yourself, and then you
Yeah.
get to this idea of command of that awareness, right? Okay, what am I going to do with this awareness? And what you said is like, oh, I'm realizing I'm doing that thing again where I'm thinking about my parent, but instead of just sitting being sad about it, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to call a friend. And then you can also get to not just command of it, but mastery of it. So when I hear one of my mom's favorite songs, it can bring me down to tears, but instead I actually say, oh, hey, mom, sort of like taking it like a step further, saying, oh, thanks for reminding me of your favorite song. And so like I literally make it real because it's still real in my brain that her presence is so powerful and with me. And so music, something somebody says, a picture that flashes up on Facebook from a year ago, it all it allows me to keep her memory alive in me. And so
Mm.
again, it doesn't, so that's where I say, it goes from the sadness of it to the beauty of it. Sort of goes back and forth between the two. And if you've seen Inside Out, sadness and joy live together.
The
And
same
that's
person. Yeah.
the same person, it's like in my brain, and they hang out together and they cannot be apart, because I can only know the depths of how open or big my heart is by knowing the sadness and well. So I go back and forth from both in
Mm.
a healthy manner, as opposed to the times where I wasn't reckoning with it and I was keeping myself in a place of tremendous heaviness and sadness for loss. And now, through just awareness and research for myself and sharing it with others, I'm like, okay, there's a balance in there. It's not going
Yeah.
to be feel even all the time, but there's definitely a balance, and I know what my tools are now.
Thank you for giving us things to like snack on in terms of our brain. Like, like we can wrap our minds around this idea, and then it sort of unlocks this, what I would call like almost space and liberation for these emotions to coexist, and for you to like place it so you can make sense of your experience. That's so powerful. I also know, Jenn, I've had experiences of coming to some of your ceremonial work around grief. I've had you come and speak to my clients, the parents that are working with me in my year-long program, to help them get into their bodies and move through some of their grief as well, and process it. I'd love to hear a bit more about also the body, like where we can harness our innate wisdom
Yeah.
in our bodies to move through and experience our grief in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I want to share a little story to enter into this piece, Vanessa, because
Yeah.
um, I have a background as a dancer. I danced as a kid, tap, jazz, ballet, hip hop, lyrical, all of the things through my adulthood. And when my dad died, it was really wonderful. I didn't know your story, Barb. I had a similar entry point. I didn't tell this personal story at the beginning, but my entry point into my own grief work was when my dad died. And I say that he died after a healing journey with cancer, because he shifted his, when we talk about making meaning and how powerful making meaning is.
Yeah.
I moved home. He was diagnosed with a stage 4 prostate cancer at age 57, and I was in my 30s. Also, I think I was 34, something like that. And he was a marathon runner. He was the picture of health. He had one of those scales that said what age you were, and he would always get off the scale and be like, I'm 30, because he was so proud of his fitness. So it was a total shock to everyone in the family that he would be someone with stage 4 prostate cancer. And when I moved, I was living in Oregon, and when I heard about the diagnosis, I just wrapped my life up in 14 days to be back with him. And the first thing he shared with me, one of the first conversations we had, was him sharing this stack, because he was a scientist, of all the research. So it's like, you sharing about the neurology. It's like that can set us free, because we can learn about things, and it can help us make sense. And on the flip side, my dad learned about he was researching prostate cancer and numbers and all of these trials. And it just got him more and more depressed, because no one has numbers as high as me. I'm the worst case scenario, right? So the more studies he printed out, the more his heart was like breaking, and he lost hope, and he lost faith that he could heal. So he showed me this manila folder that had cancer, written on it. And he said, Jenn, every time I open this file with all this research, it's just more doom and gloom. And, in that moment, I looked at my dad. I said, Dad, what if you changed the name of that file? And instead of it being a cancer file, it could be a healing file. And this moment really sticks with me, because he just like sat back in his swivel chair and was like, I like that, and he just dumped all of those research papers in the recycling, whited out cancer file, wrote healing file. And that was a real pivotal moment in his story, because then from that moment on, he wasn't, battling cancer, racing for the cure, like all of all of those like aggressive terms we use, you know, he was on a healing journey. And it just felt important to tell that piece of that story. And for me, I went on this healing journey with him, but then after, and I thought I had done lots of anticipatory grief because he lived for 3 years, and I went with him to clinical trials and all of these different healing things. But when he died, I had no ground. I had no experience with how to be with this kind of loss of a parent. I didn't have like a spiritual, religious, family, nothing, no structure, no map to hold me as to here's what we do, you know? So one of the things that, you know, I've been a dancer, and one of my mentors had said, you know, Jen, you can drum, you can sing, you can dance, and all of those things I got to, but at the beginning, I couldn't bring myself to dance. I could not bring myself to drum. And it was very hard. After I moved through that first really heavy season where all I could do was walk outside with the dog, which is why my podcast is called Walk Through Grief with Grace. Like that was my healing journey, started with walking in the woods. Like that was, and it was only because we had a rescue dog that really needed, really needed to walk in the woods. But from there, you know, when I started spending time every day being with my grief, learning from my grief, I slowly came back to movement. You know, I ended up with a daily ritual where I'd light a candle and I would burn some sage, and I would take my dad's walking stick and I'd walk in a circle. And slowly I started moving more. And sometimes it would just be rolling around on the floor, wailing, you know, and it turned into a little bit of a dance, like a walk in a circle. And then I started moving. And what I realized looking back was that was such a part of my healing, you know, all the movement that I did, you know, walking in the woods, and then starting to create this dance. It turned into a dance ritual. That's really when I was able to physically process a lot of the emotion that was either stuck in my body or moving through my body. And that's, you know, that's something that, you know, when you look at animals, that's how they process, you know, little traumas. I like to make this analogy, you know, because people can relate to it. If you're on a walk and you see dogs in a dog park or just on a walk, when they have an interaction, when they walk away, they shake, you know, they literally shake it off. So that is a response as mammals to complete the stress cycle. And movement is something that's a way for us to complete stress cycles, whether they're little moments of stress or like our day has been stressful, and at the end of the day, we need to have a ritual that completes the stress from the day, or a big loss, like the loss of a parent, that can take time, that can take seasons, a year, years, to move through that. So shaking, walking, dancing. And dancing, it doesn't mean you need to have you know, gone through, you have point shoes in your closet or something. You know, I just mean any type of movement, you know, putting on a song. Maybe, you know, when my dad died, I played his favorite music. And that would just bring me to tears right away. And that would get me crying and moving through my grief. So, you know, that's a tangible takeaway. As far as like, what can we do? You know, we can put on music, you know, and sing to it or cry to it. We can go for a walk by ourselves, with our pet, with our family member. We can get on the floor and just shake, put on a timer and shake for 3 minutes, you know, and that can really help us move that stuck energy, you know, help us move through those big emotions that we might be having. So I know that was a long story to an answer, but it felt important.
Yeah, it was so important. It was so important, and it gives us context to how you arrived to this discovery and why it's a central pillar of the work you do in your coaching, and you know, is to get people in their bodies and finding their way through their own personal rituals around their grief and loss. And I also want to say something because I am a community dancer, like I partner dance and I do social dancing, and I have found it incredibly helpful and therapeutic to also sometimes be with other people who do it first and then you come and join them. There's something like the way that you hold space. And I know, Barb, you've also, been a yoga instructor in the past, and you know what this is like. If the instructor is just saying what to do, but they're not showing you, it's really different. And then if you have your front row people who are like, okay, let's go. This pose is possible, or this shaking on the floor shaking on the floor thing is safe. I'm not going to lose my mind or something, right? I'm not going to get hurt. You have other bodies and nervous systems doing it around you. Sometimes in that context, it sets the stage for our own personal healing too. So, the whole spectrum of doing it completely by yourself in your privacy of your home, doing it on a Zoom call where you don't come on camera, or where you do come on camera, getting into an actual physical room with one other person, just your facilitator, or a whole room full of people. Or for me, like a whole weekend or three days of dancing, which I treat myself to here and there because of what it does for my nervous system, everything in between. I just really want to share that this is something I didn't realize was so connected to processing loss and grief until it became an important part of how I do in my life too.
I
And
love that we all have a dance background. So Jen, I was a dancer through my whole life and started UCLA as a dance major. And I am now a yoga instructor, so I've come back to dance, but I've always had movement in my life. And the yoga training was part of a healing journey for me as well. So very much a believer and a proponent of somatic healing, which is why I have like my yoga practice. My yoga practice is also 20 years of yoga since my dad got sick. So all those things.
solid.
You know, and that's with that long-term point that you're sharing here, I think that's important for people. Like it may be, if you have a background, it can support you when there's a major loss or trauma in your life. And if you don't, you can find your way here because you had a major loss. And then that can be something that can feed you and sustain you through all of the waves, right, of life.
Absolutely.
Forward. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also want to speak to the fact that we're not just talking about losing people. There's also like losing, whether it's like a change of a family structure, leaving preschool and going to kindergarten, leaving your friends and your favorite spot in the playground and your favorite teacher behind. I mean, there's all these like little losses to large losses that kids are experiencing. And I always say, like, let's keep in mind, and this is my first hot tip around like do's and don'ts, let's keep in mind that this might be their first life experience with this particular loss. And so that we can't make any assumptions that they're prepared for it or know what to do. And we also can't like judge how big their reaction is because they don't yet have a sense of scale, right? Like they may not understand that, like, okay, there really are more fish if my fish dies, right? Or I'm going to make new friends at my next school, right? And like because they're grieving leaving their school, like they haven't actually experienced it. So one of my favorite things to tell parents around grief and loss is like respect it when it shows up, and keep in mind that children have limited life experience, and help them understand the scale of it without asking them to put the feeling away, like trying to squash the feeling. It's like, let's explore this feeling and also sort of compare it to like reality a little bit, right? Like where can we place this? Where does this live? And then after they move through the emotion, let's look back and say, oh, okay, so did it end up working out? Okay. And they can update their database sort of like life, so that the next time they experience loss where like one of their fish dies, they can still have their sad moment, but they can also understand there are more fish, and they can cope a little better with that loss. So I just kind of want to come out with my thoughts. But there's a reason why I brought Jenn and Barb here, is because of how many of these moments you've guided your own children through, but also you work with parents as well, in your work. What would you say are the most important things that we should do and also not do when we're guiding children through grief and loss? And I want to start with you, Barb. What comes to mind?
The first thing that comes to mind, which I'm sure all parents have heard, is meet your kids where they are. My kids, you know, when I was dealing with my mom's dementia, they were little and they were only, you know, I had to explain to them what was going on, but at a level that they knew. But recently, when their grandma passed, you know, they're whatever, like 10 years older than they were when they were having this experience with their grandma losing their memory. So it's a very different experience. And being authentic about my own experience, right? Meaning talking about, yeah, this is really hard for me. And even preparing my kids and saying, just so you know, I'm going to hear this song. I'm going to actually purposely listen to this song and I'm going to get very emotional. So you will see me getting emotional when I play this song on the way to the funeral. And just, it's almost like I verbalize the warning label of how I'm going to be in certain circumstances when I know that I could get activated by an emotion. And so I verbalize it to my kids. So it's not like I wear all my emotions on my sleeve. It's like I just want to prepare them because I have had those experiences where I was really upset over something and someone caught me on the phone and made me more upset. And then I turned around and saw all three of my little kids were crying because they saw me as completely unregulated and sad and distressed. And of course, they're sad for me. And it's moments like that where I saw the impact of my words just, you know, on a sidebar that made me not hide what was happening, but give it some context, right? And there's like this fine line between being authentic and then telling everything. And it's not that we have to protect our kids from those certain things. We just have to frame them in a way that they can understand for where they are, right?
Think of it as like curating their experience of
Yes.
our
Yeah.
loss or our grief or our, you know, a strong emotion.
Yeah.
And that context can go so far because then they can place it somewhere and it's less hairy and scary and more
Yeah, and
tangible.
you know, and it's stages too. And I'll take the loss of, you know, separation and divorce. When I was separating from my ex, my daughter said, "Hey, Mom, I want Daddy to come home." I said, "You know what? Your mom and dad are trying to work on it, and you know, work on our marriage right now. So just can't come home right now." And then then we knew that we were getting divorced, and she's like, "Mom, I want Daddy to come home. Why can't he be here?" It's like, well, honey, your dad and I were getting a divorce. Your dad doesn't want to be married anymore, and I can't be with somebody who doesn't want to be married to me. So, like, just giving the basics, right? And so, not that it's black and white, but, you know, just allowing them to have just a piece of what my experience was without, like, you know, throwing somebody under the bus or getting overly emotional. Yes, we're going to have those moments too, but I sort of learned because I was trying to, same thing. If you're going through something big and emotional, the first thing you need to do is like take that oxygen mask and put it on yourself first, right? And so when you do that, then you have the capacity to make not always great, but generally good decisions in the presence of your children, you know, because you're going to have both jobs. You're going to have to take care of yourself. And if you have kids, you also have to take care of those children. And so again, I'm not perfect, but I remember those distinct moments where I was just trying to be as authentic as possible and not just try to tuck everything under the rug. I mean, that's how I grew up. Things happened, you just tucked it under the rug. You're like, we don't talk about those things. And I didn't want that to be how I raised my children.
I love that. Yeah. And hearing like authenticity with consideration for their age, for their needs in the moment around it, and making sure you're taking care of yourself alongside sharing your experience with your kids. Powerful stuff. Jen, what do you have for us on this?
Yeah. What's coming to me is trusting the moment, you know, that if you can cultivate a practice of presence, whatever that is, whatever that means for you, mindfulness, meditation, you know, qigong, you know, whatever that is, the more you can come back into your own presence, the more you can show up for, you know, that moment you shared, Barb, with, you know, your three kids looking at you falling apart on the phone, you know, letting that be an opportunity to, I think it's like you can use that as an opportunity to be with them and say, this is what just happened. Mommy's having some big emotions and that's okay. We all have big you know, and then they can realize, oh, I might fall apart and cry, and that's also okay because I watched my mom do it and she was okay. And then we had dinner, and then life kept moving on. So I think we can really let past ideas of perfectionism and, whatever take over. And it's just having that recognition that whatever experience we have personally or as a family, that can be a moment of teaching, that can be a moment of framing, like Vanessa saying, curating, that can be a moment to connect more deeply, that can be a moment to model what it looks like to be compassionate for yourself and to not go into guilt and shame and blame, especially if that's what we've done in our past or that's how we were raised, like pushing it under the rug. Often there's some layers of guilt or shame or blame or whatever. So I think it's helpful to see with those glasses that everything is okay and everything can be an opportunity for us to grow as individuals, and then for us to share that growth in the moment
Yes.
with our kids.
I love that. And it reminds me of this practice around even like having a growth mindset that I teach to my clients, where, you have a fixed mindset, thinking like, this is how this has to be, or this is how it is, or this is like a fixed quality of myself. And one of the ways we can shift them to a growth mindset is we can actually say, hang on, is that true? Like, has it always been this way? And you kind of review the past. So they're like, I'm not any good at writing. And then it's like, hang on, a year ago you said you weren't any good at reading, but look at what you can read now. How did you get there? And we sort of build this case for growth or for their capacity to learn new things, and maybe even some moments where it felt just like this. And we ask, like, what did you do to get through that? And another practice I really love with kids when they're experiencing a loss or any difficult, sort of emotionally charged experiences, helping them understand that it's temporary and we've been through something similar and we're going to get through this too. And that it's okay. It's going to be okay, that trusting yourself, that presencing, and even supplying evidence. And I think there's something about kids, like it's almost like we can time travel to a different state sometimes. Like, remember when, and then we had dinner, and then we had a fine time with our cousins when we saw them, right? Like, like just the stories, or coming back full circle back to stories, can be really helpful too. Because I think oftentimes, even for ourselves as adults, like we'll hit a wall of loss or grief or a difficult experience, and we'll forget that we've been through difficult things before. And sometimes we even need mantras around this. Like I've said to myself, I can do hard things. I've done hard things before, and they made me stronger. And I knew when to quit and when to take care of myself. Just like things like that. Knowing how to like be with it in this really humane way. Now, I have a couple questions from listeners. One comes from Elise from the Chicago area. She has kids ages 5 and 9. And I'd love to hear your perspectives, Jenn and Barb. So she says, after years of mourning, she still gets sad at times and even angry. And it's starting to feel like her heart is hardened and it's not as open as it used to be. For example, she's not feeling as deep of emotions as before. And she's a little concerned about whether this is normal, where she's not feeling as sensitive, and whether this is self-preservation or a sign that she's actually healed. Sometimes she can't tell the difference. I love the nuance of this question, by the way, Elise. I just want to kick it to you, Jenn, and then we'll hear from you, Barb. What's your perspective on this question?
Yeah. The first offering I'd like to say is that sometimes when we say healed, it seems like there's an ending point, right? Like, oh, there was this loss and I should go through 6 weeks and then I should be healed, right? I have a baby and there are this many weeks of maternity leave and then I should be ready to go back to work, right? So we have this sort of idea that there are these finish lines to healing. So I'd like to just offer up the perspective that we are ever healing year after year after year after year. So there's no end point you need to get to. And I also want to offer the perspective that there's no right way to grieve. There's no, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, sometimes we think, oh, I've got to go through these stages of grief and I've got to go through all of them or in this order. And she never intended that to be so. She was just saying, here are many things that many people that I have sat with go through. But it's not wrong if you're not angry or you didn't go through denial or what, like all of it might happen and it might not. So just giving yourself a lot of compassion for your own experience, that it is what it is, and you're moving through it as you're moving through it. So there's no wrong way. So I think that that's important to say. There's no wrong way, there's no end point. And then with that being said, I hear her say like her heart feels hardened. And when I hear that, it makes me wonder about, if there is that sense of compassion for self. And when I think about a healing journey, just personally in the moment, what's coming to me is the qualities of open, the qualities of soft, the quality of connected. So I think like as I'm in a state that feels full and whole and, vibrant and healing, I think about connected and soft. So if I'm feeling the sensation of like armor, then that's an opening, that's an opportunity for me to go, how can I be with myself in a more loving way right now? How can I be kinder? How can I be gentler with my own heart? How can I breathe into it? How can I soften? And that might look different, for is it Elise?
Please. Yeah.
Yeah. That might look like, going for a walk in the woods. It might look like going for a swim in a lake. It might look like dancing or meditating, but, a way to, to soften towards oneself. And then when we can do that, she's saying she's not really feeling the depth of emotion, then we have more capacity to connect outward when we've softened inward. So that's what's coming to mind.
Beautiful, Jen. Thank you. How about for you, Barb? What comes up for you around this question?
Yeah, just sort of add on sort of another tool to the kinds of things that Jen was saying is, first off, to Elise, I would love for you to recognize that just the fact that you have noticed this in yourself is sort of one step towards awareness, right? It's like the fact that you even wrote it out as a question means that, okay, I'm acknowledging this awareness of how I feel, this duplicitous feeling of feeling like I think I'm healing, but why do I feel so hard? So there's something there. And what I always tell my clients is when you get to that moment, can you be even more curious about what that is, right? Can you maybe at the moment say, wow, why do I feel hardened? And then ask yourself just basic questions. Am I truly, if I think, oh, is my heart really hardened? Can you ask yourself the question, is that really true? And then what we start to do, because we, again, diving into brain science, we have negative affect for almost the entire time. Our brains are prone to negativity. It's just the way we are wired. And so she may be in a place that's like, wow, I think I'm feeling a little bit better, but do I just not feel anymore? Is that why I'm feeling better? And so your brain is trying to make sense of it in survival mode, thinking, well, this must be something negative about this. But maybe the reframing and the redefinition of that state of awareness for Elise is, wow, maybe my healing is about contentment. Maybe my healing is about calmness and stability and just being in that moment of not having to feel, right? Giving your body a break, your mind a break. And so that may or may not be the answer for her, but it's just being in this place of trying to be incredibly curious about why you are feeling something, why you've had this awareness of something. When we do that, then we open up this possibility for other narratives that we can create. Like if we just did an example, it's like, my heart is hardened. Wait, is that true? Actually, no, I just cried at my son's piano recital. I'm definitely not hardened. So what about that? Then we can unpack further, either, on your own or with a coach or with a book or a guide, and be like, oh, okay. So my new normal is the narrative that I write, It's not about all those old narratives that make me have to feel sad about all these things. This is my experience. I get to draw or write the storyline.
In like kind of like the psych and therapy world, like educational spaces too, we often are investigating further. And I feel like it's what both of you are suggesting in different like there's different textures and qualities to these inquiries. But what I feel here is to get curious and also to feel into and to wonder into and see where like the mind and body and kind of like our energy is sort of guiding us towards what really is here and what is needed or what is maybe not needed, right? And I love this because it just feels like there's a whole lot less criticism and judgment and harshness around it and worry. There's a whole lot more like trust and sort of being with not only the sensations you're experiencing but yourself, and that relationship with yourself is so important. One piece that I would bring in as well is that sometimes the reason why you're not feeling big emotions is because for the first time in a long time your life is not putting you on a roller coaster. Like you've finally gotten away from something that's been highly triggering or even unsafe, getting out of situations that were really unhealthy. Maybe you're having just like a nice couple of weeks where your kids aren't getting sick and you're not getting sick and you're not losing sleep and you actually got your sleep. And this sensation of not having kind of extreme, kind of going through this ride is so unfamiliar that it's almost worrisome because you don't know it yet. And that's what I like both of your inquiries is like, wait, can we just be with it and see what's really here for us? That's lovely. Something that I didn't expect to come out of this conversation. I love these surprises. This is a great one. It's like more like a life hack. It's not just about grief and loss, but I see how it's connected. Absolutely. How we navigate. I think Jen, you unmuted yourself. Did you have something for us?
Yeah, I was just also points to that life hack of the black and white. It's so easy, how Barb was saying our mind is wired to see the worst, and right, we're always like looking for the problem. But anytime we're asking ourselves a question like, am I healed or is my heart hard? It's sort of like to soften that either or. And this is what I'm hearing around the curiosity, to just be like, oh, how about I could have a little bit of hardness in my heart and I could be healing, and I could also be a generous, kind person with a soft heart, and I could, just bringing in the fact that it all could be true, and it doesn't have to be a this or that. I think we had talked about that before we pressed record, of just like stepping into the yes and yes and yes and.
Thank goodness it's how things really are. And then it's not a hard binary. Thank goodness. I'm so relieved.
It's not a multiple choice question, right?
Right. Yeah, it's like, thank goodness there's a whole menu of possibilities. It's not just A or B. Like, I'm so grateful that that's how life actually is. And that's what our human capacity actually is, right? Mm-hmm. Our ability to heal and feel and move through and be with. Thank goodness. Whew. Phew. And so I have another question from Emma F., who is from Seattle, and she has a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old. And she says that her mom has dementia and usually doesn't recognize her or her young children. And she's wondering, how can she teach her kids to grieve the parts of her that are lost? Mm. And I want to kick this to you, Barb, especially because I know this maps onto, your experience with your own mother and her dementia.
I guess what I would say to her is, once again, sort of reckon with your own emotions first, because when someone has either Alzheimer's or dementia, the sunsetting process of watching somebody's lucidity diminish in front of you is a really heartbreaking process for the person who watches it. And you get into, some of the phases. Like, I know that I got really frustrated with my mom in the beginning because she would seem fine and she would act normal, but then she would forget things, and she just got more and more and more forgetful, to the point where she couldn't actually speak my name. Even a few months ago, where sometimes she couldn't even verbalize the things she wanted to say. So, my kids saw that at an early age. And so what was important for me was really understanding my process once again, like, what was I going through? And speaking about my process and as I would speak about my process, I became the example of how I wanted my kids to work with my mom, right? So, it was always important for me because I live in LA. My mom lived in San Francisco, and it was really, always really important for me to have my kids spend time with my mom at the house that I grew up in. And so that was the way that we would just, it was just a way of being around my mom, right? But again, it's, what is my process? How can I share that with my kids? And then the second thing is back to this idea of storytelling, right? And telling your kids about all the different things that happen. Like, for example, when my daughter is in dance recitals, I said, yeah, my mom went to every single dance recital when I was growing up. And so the way that you help your kids remember the parts of your mom that they lost is once again through sharing those stories of what it was like, going through photo albums with your mom there or with your mom not there. Those are the ways to help your kids sort of be witnesses to your process. Because truly, what's happening, uh, what we feel in ourselves is that your kids are witnessing your pain, right? And if we can help them to support themselves witnessing your pain, as well as, and to some degree, like my older kids now really truly have stepped up and supported me in my pain, it's being open, and once again, open and authentic about your own process with them in a way that meets them. Like, my oldest son has typically been, not horribly affectionate, but when my mom passed and then my brother passed, he is back to giving me big long hugs, because I think him seeing me lose my mother has really impacted him, but he doesn't talk about it. He just shows me in
Mm.
different ways that he's stepping a little closer to me.
Yeah. There's so much in here for Emma to pull on. And I think, particularly with young kids, what I've seen is that because they are fresh to life and they've limited life experience, like I shared earlier, they don't always necessarily know how to scale their response. They look to us for that guidance. And so what you were saying about like the way of being around your mom, I mean, this is an opportunity for her to, and she can do that. She happens to be one of my clients. Like we can work on this together, Emma, but kind of thinking through and preparing, like how are you going to presence around this when there are moments of forgetfulness, when there are moments of awkwardness, when her own feelings come up, and she can have a sense of like what would be really helpful for her young ones to see and experience in this new life experience, and get guidance from them, from her. And also their scale of loss is going to be wildly different because they've only had a limited amount of time with her mom,
Yeah.
having more of her mental capacity. So this is more how they'll know her. And so that's why the stories are important, and like how to be with this is maybe actually going to be in some ways easier for them, as long as Emma's feeling grounded in how she's being with her mom, because it's the main way they've like experienced her in person. And so sometimes we forget, we can sometimes project I'm not saying Emma's doing this, but we can project that our kids are going to have just as hard a time as we are, but they don't have that same history. So in some ways they have more flexibility around how to be with things
Absolutely.
that we would be very deeply impacted and sad about.
Yeah.
I've
And
seen that.
my kids created new memories that I didn't have with my mom, you know?
Yeah.
Like they would play blackjack with my mom all the time, and they would see these little moments of lucidity. Like she still had her numbers. She still could figure out how to count to 21, even though she couldn't remember my name. So
Yeah.
they they cherish those moments, and it's a completely different experience from what I had with my own mom.
Yeah. Like I see my grandmother as like a total card shark, and she really is. She wins all the time in our like family card tournaments. But my sometimes my stepdad will say things like, yeah, she used to be such a great swimmer. And like I don't have that history. I don't mourn that part of her because I don't remember her being so active on the beach. I just know of her like this cool lady who can lay it down on the card table. So there's also this redeeming possibility here for the little ones. Jenn, I know you have something to add to this.
Yeah, I just want to say that sometimes we think everything needs to be a conversation with our kids, and just to think a little bit out of the box around how we might be with them. It may be to draw a picture It may be to bring a flower to the river. It may be, something like that, where it's not like, here, I'm sitting down, we're face to face. What do you want to talk about around this hard thing? So just bringing in the body, bringing in a hug, bringing in a drawing, bringing in some creativity, bringing in the pet, the cat to just snuggle with, all of those things are healing acts too.
Absolutely. I was even thinking, like, with some of my clients, they come up with in their families like little hand signals for when something's happening that they just want to acknowledge, but not necessarily process. So like one of my dear friends whose father was starting to show signs of dementia, she and her two young kids, ages like 8 and 10 at the time, she would just go, and then they would go back to her, and they would have a little like small smile, and then they would kind of shift the way that they were treating grandpa, knowing that he might need a little more support. Like, oh, there he goes again. He's without saying it, there he goes again, forgetting his stuff, and, being confused about who is who and mixing up names and everything, and just sort of help them sort of just dial into this, way of being around grandpa. And those kinds of things can be really sweet too. And on the theme of not having to have a long conversation every time where you're like face to face, you can have these shortcuts and shorthands and ways that you can just be with each other and be with the grandparent or the person. And this goes for like bedside cancer patient moments where, now auntie doesn't have hair, and dog that has coming back from surgery and is missing half their fur and has all these stitches and now has a cone. What is it? What's going on? Helping them integrate that and how we presence around that. And like you said, Jen, so many ways we can do that without having a long, hard talk about it. Even just by modeling, oh, look, she's still wagging her tail. Okay, she must be happy to see us. She can't get up like she usually does, but she will soon, just even those little moments like, oh, look at that, right? And like, how can we still play with her in a sweet way, right? In a gentle way. Looking for that evidence. So coming to this question that I like to ask all my guests, and by the way, Barb and Jen, this has been so enriching. So we're going to kind of bring it home here. I want to know if you could go back to your child's first experience of loss and whisper one thing to yourself about the parenting piece of that, what would it be and why? Jen, I'd love to hear from you first, and we'll hear from Barb.
What just popped in my head was stay here, because I had like a few different moments of his, that I thought of. And then I went all the way back to when he was very young, and we experienced this traumatic moment together. My son was only, I think, 6 weeks old. And I had him in the carrier, and it was the first time I was taking him by myself in the car to drive to the midwife. It was like the first midwife checkup at 6 weeks or something. And we experienced a trauma of witnessing another child fall out of an SUV who wasn't strapped in. And I was completely freaked out. And the parent ran out, but for a few moments the child was there and we witnessed it, and the parent was not. They had not strapped him in. They were, getting stuff from the apartment to the car or something. And I'm reliving this moment of, then I was running, I was cutting it close on time. We had to get to and it was like a 50-minute drive. And I hit his head putting him in the car seat because of the shaken upness. And I strapped him in, and he was crying. And I was like, we've got to get to this appointment. We can't be late. And drove with him screaming, in the back. And it was like going back to that moment, like, can I stay here? Like, whatever that is not that important. Like, we can be late, we can reschedule. Whatever that managerial brain is telling you is the most important thing is stay here. Just be here in this moment. It's really hard. And your kid might be experiencing something really big emotionally, but just be fully present. I wish that I had been fully present with him in that moment.
Powerful. Thank you, Jen. I'm sure those words will resonate with a lot of the listeners. they're resonating with me. Barb, how about you? What comes up for you?
I think the first words come into my head, it's going to be okay. And for a long time, just for myself, it was hard to say that, actually. And, loss, starting with my dad, but then lost. It's interesting because there's a parallel that I found with the loss of my dad and the loss of my marriage. And the other reason it comes to mind is because it was the thing that my dad would always say to me, right? So when he was gone, he couldn't say it to me. When I went through subsequent losses, he wasn't there to say it to me, but I could still actively hear the way he said it to me. And had I had that resilience and strength in me when I was going through sort of the worst part of my own losses, when my kids were younger, it would have helped in the moment, right? But it was hard for me to believe it. And I'm sure I said it along the way. I just don't remember the feeling behind it because I think I was probably on autopilot. It's like, it's going to be okay. And it ties back to that whole authenticity piece. I think I may have said it then, but I don't know that I felt I truly believed it. Whereas now I know it to be true. And it took different things to happen in my life where I was able to show myself that it is all true. And then I get to look back on my experiences and know that everything's okay.
It's like that search for evidence again. Kind of
Yeah.
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 And
evidence. And there's
so
a lack of faith in it too. Like
yeah.
it's hard to believe at times, but then you have to remind yourself that your belief of it is what makes it true. It is your story. You get to write it. Start believing in that narrative.
And that can make all the difference. And wow, there's been so much in this conversation that I know listeners are going to pull from. And for myself, I can't wait to listen to it again and again, because there's something that really soaks in on a deeper level in your psyche when you hear these things like, be here, stay here, it's going to be okay. And that idea of presencing and rewriting narratives. And there's so many gems here. So I just want to thank you both for being so generous with your time and bringing your expertise forward for our community at the Calm Empowered Parent. It's been incredibly enriching. And I know folks are going to want to know how to get in touch with the two of you. There's a lot of info in the show notes. And so it's just been such a pleasure, you two. I'm excited to see what people pull from this. And it's not every day that I can say that I feel excited about grief and loss. So you are clearly working some magic in the world. And thank you, thank you, thank you. As we wrap up, remember, there's no one-size-fits-all way to parent. Keep nurturing those strong family bonds and watch resilience bloom in your community. You've got this. And if you found this episode valuable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You can also hop over to thecalmempoweredparent.com for current events and to grab your copy of the Calm Parent Strategy Guide. You can even learn how to bring our free and low-cost workshops to your school or community. Your support means the world to us and helps us empower more parents and children. Let's do this together.